The 56th book that I completed in 2024 is Woodrow Wilson, a biography by John Milton Cooper Jr. It is thick. It took about 45 hours to get through. It's really good, and it picks up once the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations take precedence, which is pretty early in terms of, I mean, being that it was the last 5 or 6 years of his life, it probably comes up about halfway through the book. So the last 5 or 6 years of his life take up about half of the total book. I learned a lot from this book. I felt like I knew a little bit about Woodrow Wilson coming in. I did a historiography paper on Wilson, but that was as an undergrad many years ago. Um, I've since learned some criticisms of Wilson, like racism, um, and also that he was a cheater, that he cheated on his wife um, with Edith Wilson, who ended up marrying. And there's definitely some whitewashing that's been done of Wilson in this book, which I have to criticize it for. Um, I think that his racism comes through as what we would think of as stereotypical racism for the 1920s, the 1910s, the 1920s. Um, there was some anti Semitism in him and there was some racism in him, but not to the point that he was saying the N word, not to the point that he was in favor of the Ku Klux Klan. Um, I don't want to normalize racism, but it didn't go past what others would have considered the same at the time. As far as cheating on Edith Wilson, or sorry, it's for Ellen Wilson, his first wife, with Edith Wilson, I trust the book. There's no evidence that he even met Edith prior to his first wife's death, so that seems to be false. However, the book makes a big deal out of Wilson's virility, um, almost cringeworthy virility that this guy seemed to have quite the sex drive. And so while no affair is mentioned in the book, I think it's fair to assume that when the author is talking about Wilson's virility, he is talking about probably an affair. The things that I learned about the book, again, it's been a long time since I studied Wilson, but I thought that once he had his stroke, he was done. I didn't think that he ever came out of that stroke, and I thought that he died not in office, but from that stroke. And yet, that's not true at all. He made a bid for the presidential nomination in 1920, which would have been his third run. And he was thinking about running in 1924 because his health had rebounded a little bit. He was walking with a cane. His mouth was open all of the time, which his contemporaries thought made him seem senile. He lost the ability to type on a typewriter with both hands, and yet he still felt like he was in good enough health to run for president in 1924. Of course, he didn't because he died in 1924. The book also defends Wilson in that because the United States didn't join the League of Nations 20 years after World War I, World War II begins. So the book is generous toward Wilson in that way. Also, the book argues that since Lincoln and Jefferson, there was no other more revered president during his time in office than Woodrow Wilson. And I also learned that Wilson has a lot in common with Jimmy Carter in that he was a complete Washington, D.C. outsider who came to office and didn't really court the opposition. He felt like as a Democrat, he could get things done with Democrats and didn't need the Republicans at all. And of course, when the Senate and the House go Republican and vote against the League of Nations, his theory is proven wrong. And that reminds me of Carter, who came to the White House and basically tried to do the same thing, tried to ignore the legislative branch and just pass things from the executive branch. Wilson seems to have suffered from that same mistake. overall, I think it's a good book. I don't think earlier this year I read George Washington's biography by Ron Chernow, and it was so good and so easy to read. This book took me a little while to get through. It's still very good, and I learned a lot. But you have to be really invested in learning about Woodrow Wilson, I think, to read this particular biography of him.